Thurgood Marshall and the work that he did is really one of the main reasons I wanted to be a lawyer. Thurgood was a fighter. He was a boxer in the courtroom. As a daughter of parents who were active in the civil rights movement, I knew that the fight for civil rights, the fight for equality, the fight for justice is going to take place in many ways, but one of the most significant ways, by lawyers understanding the power of their advocacy to make change and to make reform happen.
If you're just now joining us, my name is Rain Augustine, and right now live I have the pleasure of speaking with Distinguished Professor of Law James Douglas from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
I am great. Now, Professor, everyone knows that Vice President Kamala Harris was sworn into office using the personal Bible of Thurgood Marshall. Now, I know that classes are virtual right now. Things are a little bit different, but what is the sentiment? What's the reaction from faculty and staff at the law school?
Oh, I think the faculty and staff is ecstatic that Kamala Harris would use the Bible of Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall is an icon when it comes to civil rights. He, along with Charles Hamilton Houston. Actually, Charles Hamilton Houston was the architect of the whole process to defeat segregation. And Thurgood Marshall not only was a part of this whole process in terms of planning, but he is the one person who moved forward to institutionalize all these changes through the legal process.
Now, for those who maybe are unfamiliar, can you give us a brief history of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law in Houston, Texas?
Well, if you think back, well, I won't say think back, but if you remember back to your history, and it's funny, I know they really don't teach us the real history and the African Americans' involvement in the real history. But in the late 1930s, Thurgood Marshall and Hamilton Houston started this process of defeating segregation. And one of the avenues they used was education. And they decided that the best avenue to start with an education was a graduate education, and they selected law as the arena that they wanted to actually process this whole movement. So in the 1930s and 40s, up until that time, if you were an African American and you wanted a law degree, a medical degree, or a PhD, there was nowhere in the segregated states that you could go and pursue an education. So if you lived in Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, there was nowhere for you to go. And what the states did, rather than create an opportunity for African Americans within their borders, they simply paid your expenses if you could get into a school somewhere else. And so if you look prior to the 1950s, African American doctors, African American lawyers, African American PhDs went to places like Harvard, Yale, NYU, places that they could get into, Columbia, and the states paid for them. So they started this process that under the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, which requires equality for all, also required that the states that had law schools within their borders had an obligation to provide an opportunity for African Americans within the borders of the state. And therefore it was unconstitutional to force African Americans to leave the state to get an education in those areas. And so they pursued a lawsuit. The first one was in Missouri, Supreme Court agreed. Unfortunately, that case was mooted. That means that it was dismissed because the plaintiff in that case, prior to the Supreme Court hearing, on a rehearing, actually disappeared and was never seen again in life. So let's move forward to the mid 1940s. In Houston, Texas, there was an African American by the name of Heman Sweat. Heman Sweat filed to get into the University of Texas. He applied to get into University of Texas Law School. The president and the dean of the University of Texas Law School sent him a letter. And the letter basically said, even though you're qualified in every aspect, we can't admit you because you're Negro. And under the law, Negroes are not permitted to attend the University of Texas. At that point, the state, because of what had happened in Missouri earlier, realized that they were going to have to provide an opportunity within the borders of Texas for Heman Sweat to be educated. And so they asked the state courts to give them a continuance, and that is the latest case before you hear it until we have an opportunity to create a law school for Negroes within the state of Texas. And so the suit was filed in 46. In the spring of 47, the state legislature passed a law, and it provided for the creation of a university equivalent to the University of Texas, including a law school, a medical school, a school of engineering, all the programmings that were at the University of Texas. This was in the spring of 47. In the summer of 47, the state purchased a private African-American university called Houston College for Negroes. They purchased it in June of 47. In the fall of 47, they opened this university as Texas State University for Negroes. Thurgood Marshall was the lead attorney that appealed this case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1950, the Supreme Court decided, even though Texas had created this new university for African Americans in the city of Houston in the state of Texas with a law school, possibility of a medical school, it was not equivalent to the University of Texas. And so they forced the state of Texas to integrate the University of Texas Law School. And that's how integration got started in Texas. Thurgood Marshall, just as he pursued integration in Brown and all those other cases, was the main attorney arguing this case before the Supreme Court. So in the mid-70s, the university decided that the proper thing to do was to name this law school after Thurgood Marshall, because he had played such an important role in its creation as a public institution.
Now, Professor, so you're joining us from the Thurgood Marshall School of Law from TSU, Texas Southern University, which is an HBCU. Now, Marshall and Harris are both graduates of Howard University, which is also an HBCU. What role do you think historically Black colleges and universities play in shaping the future for leaders and public servants?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. And, you know, I've heard a number of, including the vice president, mention the importance of being able to develop themselves fully in this environment. You know, I did a graduate law degree at Stanford, and it was really funny because a lot of times I was very forward in class. I spoke up, I challenged my professors, and so I had classmates, you know, going to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all these other places, and they would ask me, how do you feel so comfortable speaking up in class? How do you feel comfortable challenging the professors? And I said, because that's what I was taught at Texas Southern. I was taught that I had as much a right to speak up as anybody else in class. And so I was not afraid to speak up in class. And so I think that's what the vice president has said when she talks about being given a platform to develop your leadership skills at the HBCUs, because the HBCUs give you that freedom to move around without the shackles of segregation. I remember talking to one of my professors and one of the associate deans when I was at Stanford, and I said, do you all realize what you do to students? One is you don't have enough critical mass. I'm sitting in a class with 130 students. I'm the only African American in the class. I can't focus on what we're talking about in the class because I'm sitting in class thinking, what kind of society would allow this to happen? And so I think a lot of time people at the predominantly white institutions don't realize the kind of environments they place their minority students in because they don't ever think about the necessity to have a critical mass so that they can be comfortable in the environment.
Now, earlier we showed our audience a video of VP Harris from her social media where she described Thurgood Marshall as a boxer, a fighter in the courtroom. How would you describe Thurgood Marshall?
Look, Thurgood was definitely a fighter. I think people don't realize, you know, it's really funny. I don't know if you saw the movie Thurgood, and a wonderful movie. It was about a case that he tried in Connecticut. And so I was talking to my class about the case, and I said, I had two problems with the movie. One is they don't make it clear that even though there's so much racism that's shown in the case, that this is Connecticut. This was not Mississippi. This was not Alabama. This was Connecticut. So if he was dealing with that kind of racism in Connecticut, what it would have been like in Mississippi and Alabama at that time. I said they also don't show that at that time, now we know about the Legal Defense Fund, we know about the NAACP and their legal efforts, but the movie didn't show at that time, and most of early time, there was only one lawyer. Thurgood was the only lawyer. He was traveling all over the country, trying all these cases by himself.
You mentioned the sacrifices that he made. I'm familiar, I think we all are familiar with Thurgood Marshall's work in the realm of civil rights and, of course, as the first African-American Supreme Court justice. But, you know, Professor, when I was doing my research kind of in preparation for this interview, I can definitely see why Vice President Harris considers him one of her personal heroes. I mean, I was honestly blown away not only by his personal achievements, but the personal sacrifices that he made, all for the sake of public service.
Oh, I think it's without a doubt, because remember, he was all over the country, trying cases all over the country, single-handedly. One of the things, because he was such a personable individual, he was huge, he was very aggressive, and so he had the ability to bring in volunteer lawyers, because if he didn't have that strong personality to bring in those volunteer lawyers to assist him, he never would have been able to do it, because at that time, the NAACP really did not have the finances to really support all of this litigation that was taking place at that time. So he had a very strong personality, very friendly, very personable, a very interesting individual. And you're right, he made a sacrifice, because you could not all these cases in all these different places and be at home with your family.
Yes, I also read that while he was traveling the country trying these cases, he would sometimes have to sleep at multiple homes in a single night, all for his own safety. So when we talk about the significance of the cases that he has tried before the Supreme Court, I know there are many, but if you had to choose...
You have to remember, during this time when he was traveling, African Americans couldn't stay at the Hilton, they couldn't stay at the Marriott, they couldn't stay at the Four Seasons. So Thurgood generally stayed with people who were friendly. I'm talking about other African Americans who were friendly to the cause. And so most of his experiences, he stayed with people in the cities, African Americans who were involved in civil rights. So people have to understand, I remember when my daughter was 13, we were in Washington and we were at a major hotel. I won't name it, but she said, "Daddy, this is my favorite hotel. I like the room service." She's just telling me all the stuff she liked about this hotel. And she said, "When you were growing up, what was your favorite hotel?" So I had to explain to her that when I was growing up, we couldn't stay in a hotel. We had to stay with relatives. You had to sleep in the car, but there was no place. I couldn't go to the Four Seasons. I couldn't. So I think sometimes when people look at the sacrifices that people like Thurgood Marshall made, they really can't appreciate it because they don't understand the racial climate at that time. I mean, there were times when Thurgood escaped lynching. I mean, people don't realize that his life was on the line when he tried cases in Mississippi and Alabama and Florida. And there were a couple of instances where white people had to protect him from the Klan.
Now, speaking of the cases that he's tried, I was just mentioning there are so many significant cases that he tried before the Supreme Court. And if you had to choose, which case do you think was the most significant when it comes to kind of laying the groundwork for future leaders?
Now, most people think it's Brown. I think it's Sweatt. Because if he had lost the Sweatt case, there would have been no Brown case. So Sweatt was the first case where the Supreme Court really said a state had to allow an African American to go to school with white students. And people have to understand, and the architect of the plan was, why don't we integrate graduate education first? Because we're never going to get white men to let little white girls go to school with little black boys until we can first convince them that it's all right for grown black men to go to school with grown white women. Am I making that clear? So the idea was, if we can't get white men to understand that it's all right for white women to be in the same environment with black men, we're never going to get them to understand how it's all right for little white girls to be in the same room with little black boys.
I think that we can talk probably for hours about Thurgood Marshall, the work that he's done and his historical impact. But you know, the last year, especially this last election season, we have seen a lot of civil unrest in our country. So what lesson do you think we can take away from his work?
Well, I think the lesson we ought to take away is that we ought to really study and understand his work. I think the reason we don't really appreciate what's going on today is, and this came about in a discussion I had with a white friend of mine, a male. We've been friends from the early 70s. And he was talking about the insurrection, the thing that happened on January 6th. And I said, David, you can understand it if you realize that in 1860, November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He was sworn in March of 61. Between November and March, 7 states had seceded from the Union. He said, even before it was sworn in, I said, yes. Racism was so prevalent, they couldn't even wait for Lincoln to be sworn in, that they started leaving the Union immediately after he was elected. He said, well, why didn't I learn that in school? I said, nobody learned that in school because they don't ever teach us the real history. So I think we would have a better appreciation for Thurgood Marshall if they really taught people the real history of the United States and not try to sugarcoat it.
Distinguished Professor of Law, James